All right, I'm going to kick us off. Hi again, everyone, and welcome to our ninth episode of Data Talks, which is a series of free 45-minute webinars about using local data to inform housing policy. My name is Tony Budulovic. I am the Data and Policy Analyst at the Housing Solutions Lab, and I'm really excited to talk to you all today about heirs properties and tangled title issues, including how cities can use some data to understand the extent of those issues in their communities. Today, I am joined by Ryan Brenner, the Policy Research Fellow at the NYU Furman Center, who will give us an overview of tangled titles, including some of the risks that they pose to residents and cities alike. I'm also delighted to welcome our panelist, Vinita Wagh, who is a project manager with the Center for Equity, Engagement, and Research at Detroit Future City, and who will be sharing her insights when it comes to identifying and analyzing these properties in Detroit. And next slide, please. But before we dive in, I want to start things off with a very brief introduction to the Housing Solutions Lab and this series as well. Ryan will give us a great presentation on tangled titles to follow that and cover some of their causes, as well as how cities can begin to think about measuring and addressing tangled titles. And then we'll have a conversation with Vinita and her firsthand experience when it comes to measuring and addressing that in Detroit. And finally, we'll have about 10 minutes for your questions in the Q&A, so please feel free to submit them via the Q&A function at any time during the session, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Great. So if you're not familiar with the Housing Solutions Lab, we are based at the NYU Furman Center, and our mission is to help small and mid-sized cities plan, launch, and evaluate housing policies with the ultimate goal of advancing equity, health, and well-being. And with that, I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you'll take the opportunity to view past episodes on our website and register for upcoming ones. Each of these sessions has a fireside chat with someone like Vinita, who has experience on the ground, and we also post recommended reading as well. And I'm going to drop this link in the chat shortly. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it to Ryan now for our presentation.
Great. Thanks so much, Tony. So I'm going to be talking about tangled titles, sometimes referred to as heirs property. This is part of a larger project that the Furman Center did, looking at threats to deeds and home ownership in New York City. These slides will be shared afterwards, so you can click on the link to our blog post discussing that project, as well as look at some of the key findings we had about properties at risk to a number of threats to deeds, both aggregate numbers, some descriptive statistics, as well as spatial distribution across the city. But for this presentation, we're just focusing on tangled titles. So I'll start by explaining what tangled title is, then outline some of the risk to properties with tangled title, walk through our methodology for identifying tangled title, and then briefly discuss how tangled title is resolved. So first, what is tangled title? There are many ways property rights can be transferred. So a deed when you buy a home, a lease when you rent, etc. Then there's also mechanisms like eminent domain, adverse possession, and foreclosure that transfer property rights without the owner's full consent. Most relevant to tangled title is intestate succession, which is when the owner of property dies without a valid will. So state law determines how the property is divided amongst their heirs. So we have an example here of a very simple family tree. The red shapes at the top own a home, their children are the blue shapes, and their grandchildren are the green shapes. And so in this instance here, the owners have a valid will that conveys their interest to the house, in this case, to the blue circle. So when they die, the house transfers in full to the blue circle per the will, and the blue circle is now full ownership over the home. However, if we go back and assume that the owners did not have a valid will, so that's either they didn't have a will at all or had a will that was contestable, the probate court would likely distribute a fractional interest in the house to each of their heirs, following state law. And this means that each of the heirs, so each child, becomes a co-owner of the property, and then any major decisions regarding the property has to be made jointly. While this might be manageable for several siblings, here it's just two, If those siblings then also die intestate, their fractional interests are further divided amongst all of their heirs, so all of the grandchildren in green. So over generations, this can cause the number of owners to increase exponentially, and each person's share begins to shrink. Additionally, shares are not necessarily equal within a generation, as it's based on how much the parent owned and how many heirs that share is divided among. So in this example above, each of the siblings, because there was only two, owned 50%, but one had three children and the other had two. So the cousins are ultimately inheriting unequal shares to the property. And just to clarify, this is an extreme simplification. Tangled title can arise from contested wills, so there may be wills present here. And then additionally here, we're assuming that the couples die essentially as a unit, since state law would determine how property is divided amongst a surviving spouse and heirs. But this is just showing what can happen, particularly with properties that don't have wills, as they're passed down through generations. So what are some of the risks to properties that have tangled title? So in addition to just being complex, there are also some tangible risks. First, since the heirs are all co-owners, conflict over use of the property can result in family disputes and litigation. Selling the property also can be a challenge when it's co-owned by many and sometimes an unknown number of heirs, particularly if the property has passed through several generations. It may be a challenge to know how many third or fourth cousins own a fractional interest. Similarly, it can be difficult to obtain financing, particularly or participate in government grant programs or receive disaster assistance, because for most of these programs, they require proof of full ownership. Foreclosure is also a possibility due to difficulties delivering bills, knowing which party to deliver to, as well as disputes about who must pay. And then specific to this issue of tangled title, there's a risk of a partition action leading to a forced sale, which I'll explain a little bit since it's relevant to this issue. So returning to our previous example, each cousin owns a fractional interest in the property. So one of them may become estranged from everyone else or may face financial hardship that none of the other cousins are able to buy them out. So if a third party offers to purchase a share, they may agree to sell that share. So now the four remaining cousins collectively own about 83%, while an unrelated entity owns the remaining 17%. That entity, after purchasing this interest, can then file what's called a partition action in the court. And if the land is vacant and relatively homogeneous, the court may actually divide the land and give each fractional interest to the party based on what interest they own. But when the partition involves something like a house that's much harder to divide, the court will likely order a sale and then divide the proceeds of that sale by each party's share. And this sale is typically done via public auction instead of listed with a broker. So the unrelated entity, anticipating this outcome kind of from the get-go, is occasionally able to buy the entire property and purchase it at below market value. And so that's the option there. So how are properties at risk of tangled title identified? We started by looking at the methodology of this research done by a Pew study in Philadelphia. And what they did was essentially identify all residential properties, identify which were owned by natural persons as opposed to corporate and government entities, and then identified which owners were deceased. And so going through that flow was able, you can kind of see here in this report's available, how they break down by owned by natural persons, all owners are deceased, but survived by one owner, and then mapping where those properties are located. And so that's what we modeled our methodology off of. So to start, we use New York City's Pluto file on open data. This contains information on every tax lot in the city, including the number of residential units, as well as the owner listed on the most recent deed. So we use this data set to first filter to only buildings with 1 to 4 residential units, similar to the Pew study starting with all residential buildings. And then we filtered out So yeah, so this filters out non-residential and larger multifamily buildings to just focus on those smaller 1 to 4. And then we also were able to filter to just properties that were owned by natural persons based on the most recent owner of the deed. So from that, using that as our universe, we used ACRIS, which is a data set from New York City's online registry of deeds and other property records. So using this data set, we were able to identify the most recent document registered for each property. So sometimes that's a deed, sometimes it's a mortgage, but just looking at what is being registered against this property. We then flagged properties without any recorded actions for a substantial amount of time. So this figure is basically a waterfall that starts with our whole universe and then filters out properties with a recorded document in each year, leaving only properties that have not had a recorded document since that year. So if we start with all properties, we look, these ones had one in 2023, these ones had one in 2022, going back in time. And so what this enabled us to do is basically flag properties with deeds or other recorded documents that were older than a certain threshold. So for example, there had been nothing recorded on the property for 30 years. From here, we pulled the most recent deed for each property in our universe and compiled a list of all natural person grantees. So that's basically every buyer. And we sent this list of name and address pairs to a death suppression service to determine which grantees were likely deceased. And so death suppression services are primarily used by organizations like nonprofits with large mailing lists to remove deceased recipients from their list to save on like postage. So the services themselves use some combination of the Social Security Administration's death master file combined with other data sets like postal deliveries to try and identify which people are likely deceased. And so what's returned to us from this process is basically just a binary column of whether that person and address showed up somewhere indicating that they're likely deceased. We then took all of these flags and mapped our universe to create this interactive map, which basically lets the user set their own parameters to match their use case. So we never identified this is at risk or not at risk. We just put flags so that a user could say, for example, I want to find all properties that haven't had a document registered in 30 years or 25 years or 35 years, really allowing the user to set this customization. Similarly, we took every grantee on the deed, so it's possible to filter to just properties with one, multiple, or all listed owners as deceased. And so this project primarily worked with legal service providers, and so it allowed them to target their outreach campaigns to the different property types that meet whatever their objectives are. So how is Tangled title resolved? I'll just go really quickly over how this is resolved, what legal service providers are doing once they've identified some of these properties. So in reaching out to owners of properties with existing Tangled title or that are at risk of developing Tangled title, there are a few things that owners can do. First, estate planning and creating valid wills can avoid Tangled title altogether. Or if Tangled title already exists, working with the owners of the fractional interest can prevent it from getting worse in future generations. Lawyers can also work with all of the co-owners to negotiate consolidated ownership, which would then make the title marketable if they wanted to sell, or participate in any of those programs that they were previously excluded from by not having full ownership. Additionally, I wanted to point out that there is this Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, which was drafted to resolve some of these issues, and it's been passed or introduced by more than half of the states and territories. New York, for example, passed a version of the law in 2019, and essentially what that does is precludes parties from who purchased or otherwise acquired their interest by means other than inheritance from initiating a partition action. So in our example, where a third party purchased a fractional interest from one of the cousins and then immediately initiated a partition action to force a sale, under the law in New York, it is no longer possible for that person to be the one to initiate the action. They're still able to purchase. They would still get proceeds if there was a sale, but they're no longer able to initiate that action. And that's one of several mechanisms that try to resolve some of the issues we outlined above. And with that, I will pass it off for a discussion more about what this looks like on the ground.
Thank you so much, Ryan. That
Yeah.
was super helpful. I feel like the circles and squares in the beginning made this complex topic definitely much more intuitive for someone like me. So thank you again. I'm seeing a few questions in the Q&A, and we definitely encourage you to keep sending those our way. But for the next part of this webinar, we're actually going to have a conversation with our guest, Vinita Wagh, again, project manager at Detroit Future City, who authored an influential report on Tangled titles and heirs properties in the city of Detroit. First off, thank you again for being here, Vinita. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Of course. And to start off, I think the first question we want to go to is, can you give us a little bit of context on heirs properties and titles in Detroit and how the city is approaching that issue?
Sure, yeah. So in Detroit, we do know now that there's a significant number of residents who live in homes that they don't technically own, even though they may have inherited the property, paid taxes, maintained it for many, many years. And then even historically, I feel like Detroit has been through a lot when it comes to housing. So even if you look back at the past 10, 15 odd years, Detroit has had the highest property foreclosure rates in the country, even tax foreclosures. So that has made property ownership in the city very volatile. And it has complicated title histories because properties were passed on to public ownerships, and then maybe speculators bought them as well, right? And this is an issue that has disproportionately affected the Black community in the city because Detroit is a majority Black city. And this is a community that has maybe bought or sold homes when they had limited access to legal services, financial services, and they've passed down these homes as well. So it's left a lot of unclear successors. And that's how we see that it's manifesting in the city. Even when we spoke to homeowners, many of them did not have wills or estate plans in place. They were unaware of their property ownership status. They were navigating all the out-of-pocket costs for legal services. And then again, legal services and legal processes around this issue are very complex. So there was also a lack of support surrounding this. And so when we're talking about homeownership and preserving generational wealth, heirs properties is like an important issue because it's affecting individuals, it's affecting their family homes, it's affecting neighborhoods. And you also see some of that being reflected like on the property values in the city, like investments, how people perceive neighborhoods. So even before we began this research, the city did have programs in place for homeowners. I wouldn't say that they were specifically or directly for heirs properties in the city, but they were all geared towards housing stability. And if I have to name a couple of programs, there's like the HOPE program, which is the Homeowners Property Exemption Program. There's the Make It Home and the Tax Foreclosure Prevention Project. There's the Detroit Tax Relief Fund as well. So when a person applied to these programs, they weren't able to qualify for them because they didn't have like legal ownership of the property. And then these agencies who were part of these programs, they referred these heirs to legal assistance a lot of times to resolve this issue. And then even our funders, the Gilbert Family Foundation and the Rocket Community Fund, they're closely connected. And so they were heavily involved in a lot of the tax foreclosure prevention work that was happening in the city. So they were seeing some of this really come up in the city. And that's how this the research that we did came about as well, to understand what is the overall extent of these properties in the city. But it was only after this report was released that like work specifically around heirs properties really started gaining momentum. Yeah, and now we hear about it all the time.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that really, really critical context. And in your report, you identify that there are over thousands of Detroit properties that are at risk of tangled titles, which I think speaks to some of the widespread issues that you highlight. And so I think for our audience or other cities that are looking to understand their own landscape and assess that risk in their communities, do you have any recommendations for data sets that you think are the best place to start doing that type of analysis?
Yeah. So we worked with Data-Driven Detroit. They're also a part of the NNIP network, and they were our consultants, data consultants on the project. So they did a lot of heavy lifting when it came to the raw data. And our analysis, we identified just over 5,500 heirs properties in the city. That was like our baseline number, but we do believe that it's likely an undercount. And then when it comes to data sets, I think they're very city and county specific, but we use like a combination of public, administrative, and proprietary data sets. And we also looked at like demographic data from the Census Bureau's ACS 5-year survey. So we looked at residential property transactions. And for that, we turned to like the parcels data and the property sales data that we received from the City of Detroit Office of the Assessor. These are public data sets, so they were available on our city's open data portal. So we use the parcels to identify who the taxpayers are and what is the assessed value of the property. And then we use the property sales data set to understand what are the different types of home sales that could be related to heirs transactions. What's the legal instrument that they use to transfer the property and like verify the sale as well. But we do note that like the assessor's data does have some like inherent limitations just in terms of latency in updates, misspellings, errors. But I think regardless, these are good places to start. In terms of like proprietary data sets, we used also the Wayne County Register of Deeds because deeds are recorded at the county level. For us, it wasn't publicly accessible, but this particular data set gave us information on the type of deed that was used for a particular transaction. And then we use this, so the Wayne County Register of Deeds is more accurate and it's more broader. So this we use this to supplement the assessor's files as well. So we overcame some of the limitations of the assessor's file through this. But like our Register of Deeds data set also has its own caveat based on just the way in which deeds are recorded, but we try to be as accurate as possible. And then similar to what Ryan mentioned, we ran the list of property owners and addresses through death records to identify which of the record owners were deceased and like their date of death. So for that, we use Melissa Data's deceased suppression service. And that, again, like Ryan mentioned, is compiled from the Social Security Administration's records as well. And then apart from that, we also had data on tax foreclosure notices that were just then sent out to people in 2023. So we had access through that to that data set through the Wayne County Treasurer's Office. And yeah. And apart from that, like demographic, households, housing data all came from the American Community Survey. Yeah.
Wow, it sounds like you used a kind of wide net here and a kind of a mix of public and proprietary data.
Yeah.
And I assume that availability for some of these data sets will vary by city and county, like you mentioned. So in the case that a city doesn't have access to some of these data sources, would you say there are particular indicators that you found were generally associated with a higher risk of title issues?
Yeah, so I would assume that parcels and some version of property sales or property tax data are publicly available in most counties. But before we started with our research, we definitely looked at a couple of other papers and reports. The Philadelphia study was one of them as well. And I think they looked at real estate transfer records as well. We looked at a Deep South State study, and they used proprietary property data from CoreLogic. Then we also looked at the Jacksonville, Florida study, but they did like regression modeling at the block group level. but they did have access to tax roll and parcel data, I think. But what we noted while we were doing our research was also like some of these ACS indicators, their significance to heirs properties in a city differs city to cities. So they don't match up 100%. In terms of like the disease suppression service, we use Melissa data, but an alternative for that is vital records. There's a recent Baltimore study, and I've only heard that they use the disease suppression service called ADSTRA, which is again a proprietary data set like Melissa. But when we build our cumulative risk index, we looked at indicators that are likely to decrease risk and indicators that are likely to increase risk. So when it came to decreasing risk, there were certain flags that we looked for. One was whether the property had passed through a foreclosure redemption process, or there was some, or it had undergone estate planning or probate. So the actual indicator was the share of estate planning deeds, which again actually comes from the Register of Deeds data set. But when it came to decreasing risk, there were certain flags that we looked for, which were transfers without title work that could complicate things long term, and then also neighborhood stressors that could point to a weak housing market. So some of our ACS indicators were were individuals over 65 who were living alone, share of quitclaim deeds, basically anything that mentions anything that refers to an absence of mortgage activity or a warranty deed. And then because Detroit has a large share of vacant parcels, we also looked at that. But again, like I mentioned, relationships between these socio-demographic indicators and heirs properties like vary city to city. But some of the other data sets or proxies could be like the HOLC redlining maps. I think there's a geospatial data set available somewhere for that. Then probate court filings, which is something that you can get from the court. Delinquency records when it comes to taxes. Blight violations. Detroit doesn't really have good housing condition data, but that's probably another place. And then, as Ryan mentioned, I think no recent deed transfers or no mortgage activity is probably another flag.
Yeah, thank you. It sounds like there's a lot of different opportunities for people to pursue this analysis, even if they don't have the specific data sets. And you mentioned, socioeconomic and demographics as a potential proxy. And earlier you gestured to Black homeowners as particularly affected by this issue. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how Tangled titles intersect with racial and economic equity in Detroit, and how you thought about the idea of housing justice when you were doing this type of analysis.
I would say that the issue of heirs property and as it relates to racial and economic equity, they intersect very deeply. And we talk a lot about homes being significant assets for families and home ownership being a tool for wealth generation. And as I mentioned, Detroit's a majority Black city. So there's a lot of systemic issues that are very pervasive. We've seen neighborhoods in Detroit that were heavily redlined. So that really excluded families from traditional home ownership systems. And then properties were passed down without formal legal processes as well. So without a clear title, you're locked out of the generational wealth that home ownership is supposed to offer. So then it's difficult to sell the property. You can't refinance the home. You can't even insure it. And then because of Detroit's history, because of the massive tax foreclosures, a lot of families are unable to qualify for a lot of housing stability related assistance programs because you need a clear title for that as well. So they are always at an increased risk of being foreclosed. And to add to that, like incomes in Detroit are also low. So it makes harder for residents to access legal services, but it's it's also an issue that middle-class households in the city face. So again, there's a lot of these systemic issues that really contribute to disparities in wealth and housing stability. So when we approached this research, we try to understand how these systems and structural barriers really affect things like stability, housing stability, investment, and then they also cause the loss of wealth in Black neighborhoods. So we tried to not look at this as something that's just like a legal or an administrative barrier. So that's also the kind of narrative that you would see throughout our report. And we spoke to a lot of stakeholders about how these housing assistance and property tax assistance programs work, where there are legal challenges. We spoke to a lot of residents. We held focus groups to hear of their lived experiences and also understand whether there's actionable solutions that you can tackle today. But I think in terms of housing justice, I think we've also framed this as an issue that potentially affects every homeowner.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful, and I think it definitely makes your findings much more influential and powerful after you talk to residents and communities about your findings. I think the final question for this fireside chat portion is about, what comes after the analysis. Your report has been, I would say, very influential in the city of Detroit and beyond. And I know you're more on the data side, but I was wondering if you could share a little bit about any reforms, whether they were legal or community based, that have emerged or come about as a result of your research.
Right. So it's been about 1.5 years since we released this report. And I always feel like this is a project that really came together because of the right people at the right time. And research was one part of the process. And now now some of my other colleagues at DFC are really looking into like the implementation and partnership side. But the number that this research highlighted, which is like 5,500 properties and the $270 million that's locked in wealth, that really helped bring momentum to how people wanted to approach resolving this issue in the city, how they wanted to look at preventing future heirs properties and also like policy reforms at the systems level. Though it's a lot of the work is in the preliminary stages, but what I do know is that that this report has sparked over like $1 million worth of new investment in different phases for doing work around this issue. DFC and some of my other colleagues, they're doing a lot of work around coalition building. So they're bringing together the city and community partners who are already working in this space, who have been doing work around this issue. At the same time, I think when we released the report, the city had ARPA funds, the American Rescue Plan Act funds, that they used to set up like wills and estate planning services. Our funders, the Gilbert Family Foundation, they invested a lot in legal support to resolve current heirs properties who are at risk of tax foreclosure because they're currently also working in that space. And then there was also investment from the Federal Home Loan Bank of Indianapolis, who is doing more of like the systems level work. They're collaborating with LISC Detroit, who is doing a lot of the community-based work, and they're also trying to build out pilot interventions in the city. So yeah, so that's some of the things that are happening at the very high level.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And thank you so much for sharing all of those insights. We're getting some great Q&A questions in the chat, so I'm going to turn to some of those now. I guess we can start off with, I see that Jonathan, Ashley have kind of similar questions about privacy. So I think both of you or either one of you can speak to this. But did you encounter any concerns about resident privacy when identifying these at-risk properties, and how did you navigate some of these concerns?
Yeah, I can start with that. That was a major concern of ours. We wanted to make sure that while we were identifying properties for legal aids outreach, we weren't at the same time making a list of viable targets for third parties. So most of the data that we used, with the exception of the death suppression, is available to the public. not necessarily in a way that makes this readily doable, but it is publicly available. Our analysis of this is not public. So the map that we shared is password protected and only shared with legal aid. And the blog post that we did only talks at aggregate levels. So for those reasons of security, we haven't released like a list or a map of properties that we've flagged. And also in our discussions of methodology, we've been very intentionally vague about some of the thresholds. So like when we're talking about no deeds for a long time, we don't really specify what a long time means to us or what legal aid is thinking of as a long time. It's just showing that this is how we've gone about that process. And so if folks are interested in more specifics, you can reach out privately and we can talk about some of the specifics that we've done. But we've kind of tried to strike that balance of working with largely open data and keeping it private as possible.
Yeah, I think I echo some of what Ryan mentioned because we primarily worked with parcels data and tax assessors data that is publicly available. But what we also know is that, when you try to track as properties, it's something that's really invisible even in official records. So it's really hard to get to which property is now an heirs property. But when I mentioned that D3 was working, like Data Driven Detroit was working a lot with us, they received the foreclosure notice data from the Office of the Treasurer. They received like the raw data, but we only received like the anonymized aggregated data. So we've been really careful about sharing data with partners, and definitely the funders are working in the tax foreclosure space, so they do have access to that data. But a concern for us was also the ethics of publicly releasing data of where heirs property are, because you don't want to actively shape perceptions of people about the neighborhoods that they live in or they would want to live in, or also like just perceptions of neighborhoods for speculators and investors as well.
Yeah, really great answers. I think the follow-up, there's a couple of people who are really interested in these proprietary data sources. So maybe either one of you can answer this, but what was the average cost range for some of these, and how reliable or how far back could you go back in some of these data sources, especially when it comes to death suppression records, for example?
We use Melissa data for the disease suppression service, and I think from what I remember is we submitted around 625,000 records, and in terms of cost, I think we were charged back then about $1 for every 1,000 records. Yeah.
Yep, we also use Melissa, and it's very similar. We send every grantee going for like all of the universe. It was hundreds of thousands of names, and I think the total came between $300 and $400.
Got it. And I think this question is more for Ryan, but could you say a bit more about how Tangled titles occur differently in rural versus urban contexts, and what are some of the key factors that might shape some of those differences?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the biggest differences that we've noticed about Tangled title in rural context versus um, a city like New York is in the rural context, there's often a lot longer period of time for a property to pass from generation to generation without clear title. So when you're looking at kind of that initial purchase, it's much farther back in time, perhaps before digitized records. So like in New York, I think it would be rarer to find a property that was initially purchased um, even beyond like the 1900s, late 1800s, that was subsequently passed on and on and on. And so that both has implications for the quality of data that you're using and trying to find that initial deed, but also the number of people that are involved. So I think in the urban context, it's not uncommon for that three generation to be where Tangled title starts to manifest, Whereas in the rural context, it really can be generations of a family living on a particularly large plot of land. That's the other difference is that in cities, it's usually a home. Whereas in rural contexts, it's a much larger piece of land, often with several homes from different members of the family on the land.
Thanks for sharing. I think both of you might be able to speak to this, but you both mentioned kind of there were some elements of limitations in this data, whether there were, things were entered incorrectly or things were incomplete. And so could you say a little bit more about how you went about validating some of that incompleteness or missingness, and if you were able to overcome some of those gaps in the data?
When it came to the Detroit study, the assessor's data, like I mentioned, had quite a few limitations in terms of like latency in updates, and then there were misspellings as well. So we really used the Wayne County Register of Deeds data to supplement it. So and then make sure that we're casting a broader net as well. So it was a lot of behind the scenes data work. Yeah.
Yeah, I think very similarly, like we very much viewed this as flags of risk instead of identifying tangled title, because in order to find properties that currently have tangled title, that would require a lot more information and a lot more property specific information that would be harder to pull from data that's available open or even proprietary. So I think that is kind of the approach we took was also casting a wide net and then letting users decide what are the flags or what are the thresholds for flags for our kind of target. Because all of the individual flags, like there are flaws with, well, this is missing and capturing wrong people for tangled title, but the logic behind this being a indicator is sound. So it's kind of a mix of combining multiple flags and recognizing that being flagged doesn't mean that it's tangled title, and not being flagged doesn't mean that it's not.
I think what also helped us was directly speaking to people who work with the Office of the Assessor, who work at the Office of the Assessor and the Register of Deeds, because we were really able to identify what are the fields that we should be paying attention to, what those fields mean, and then together figuring out a data strategy. Like that informed our data strategy as well.
Yeah, I'm sure connecting with stakeholders definitely improved your data quality. I think we have time for one final question, and I'm seeing a question from Andrew in the chat, whose practice is seeing families lose homes in the probate process due to Medicaid estate recovery. And he says that even for homeowners who do have wills in place, their heirs are still losing their homes to Medicaid. And he's wondering if either of you know of any data or studies that have been published that are kind of covering this, or any further information.
I don't know about this particular issue. Our blog post was looking at threats to deeds from a broader perspective. So that brought in other issues like fraud and signing over deeds under false pretenses of refinancing. So I think that there are a lot of threats to deeds, both this population that is at risk of tangled title, but also more broadly. But I don't know anything specific about Medicaid.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that sums up our time here. I'm going to put something in the chat where you guys can access more information about our Data Talk series. And you can also email me questions and Ryan questions if you have any. But yeah, thank you all again for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at our future Data Talks. Thanks again.
Thank you.